Okay, here's an overview shot of this utility solar hybrid system, and I'll run through the primary components. On the left here, where my mouse pointer is currently pointing, we have the DC disconnect box. It's got a breaker for the PV array, a breaker for the charge controller, and a breaker for the inverter. The inverter, of course, turning the turning the low voltage 24 volt DC battery voltage into 120 volt AC voltage to power your conventional freezers. And the charge controller located above, of course, manages the input current, the charging current and scenario to the batteries, and also provides a couple of auxiliary settings and control settings to allow us to transfer the freezers and critical loads on and off the solar based on battery state of charge. There's a couple of sub panels here, small breaker boxes, the one for the inverter and solar transfer circuit, and the other for the utility power to that transfer circuit and to the inverter, in case you decide that there's a need for you to charge the batteries off the grid. You can always throw this large breaker on in the inverter box here, the 60 amp breaker, which is normally left in the off position. I'm going to talk in a little greater detail about the control circuit, which is again controlled by the charge controller. The status screen, if you look at my mouse, the status button will bring up a status screen which will scroll between some information telling you how much current and is coming in from the PV array and what the voltage of that input voltage is. Here it's getting dark out, so the input voltage is 21.2, lower than the battery voltage, and we're not charging. And this screen, when you're in the status mode, will scroll between current and battery and some temperature settings and whatnot, and good information to be able to access there off of that screen. The menu button allows us, using the left and right, move through the different programming modes for setting up the charge controller and the various states of charge and voltages that the transfer will take place between the utility and the solar. So essentially, let me switch over here to this control box, which houses a couple of relays. And one of them is a power relay, transferring those loads to and from the grid or the solar, and the other relays being control relays that are switched off of this the setting between float or voltage on that transfer, and I'll explain that in greater detail. First, let me mention that we're running on grid power here right now, and you'll see that neither of the green LED indicator lamps associated with the transfers are illuminated, and therefore we're running on the grid power. The grid, this transfer switch will always fail to the solar, so if there's a loss of utility power, it will always transfer over to the solar regardless of whether there's a float situation or a high enough voltage to bring that transfer about automatically. In the event of a power outage, it will always run off the solar until your batteries are essentially depleted, but hopefully we've sized the system adequately to bring it through a few cloudy days and keep things running for you in terms of your freezers. So anyways, the settings that do happen automatically are there to provide you with a savings in terms of the fact that you're going to be running your freezers off of the solar when there's adequate solar and power available from the sun and the system. And there's two different settings for a good reason. This lower setting, this transfer on voltage, means that as the, excuse me, I had to hang that up. As the voltage comes up during a daily charge cycle, we can have that transfer take place and power the freezers off of the solar at a voltage setting that would be realized typically early in a solar day, and transfer back off of that, off of running the loads off of the solar into the evening or night hours before the battery is discharged very deeply. This is going to increase the longevity of the battery pack. You're not going to frequently discharge them very deeply. You're only going to use the top end of those batteries. And that also not only leads to a longer life battery, but it also leaves the batteries at a nearly full state of charge in the event that there is a power outage and you do have to transfer off of the grid and run them continuously. Then you still have a decent state of charge on those batteries coming into that power loss event. What we have this other setting for, the transfer on float, is that during extended cloudy periods you may run into a situation where the voltage becomes high enough during the daylight hours to realize that transfer, and then transfers back off as the voltage falls towards the end of the day, but never really reaches a full state of charge. And what you'll see when that happens is you'll get a little alarm light on the charge controller that'll indicate you haven't seen a full state of charge for 1 week. And if that should occur, you've been through some cloudy weather, it's maybe November, and it's gotten into the cloudy period here in Wisconsin, you would then just flip that switch to the transfer on float, and now the transfer will not take place until there has been a full state of charge. The battery has fully recovered and the charge controller has dropped the battery into a float state, meaning that it is, again, fully charged. As I mentioned before, regardless of these settings, if there's an actual power outage, though, the loads will remain on the solar system and the inverter and the batteries until the power is returned. And these indicator lamps, right now, what we're seeing here, neither of the two transfer conditions have been met, and we are in the transfer when we reach a full state of charge and it goes into float. And we see that the indicator lamp indicating that the loads are being ran off of the utility grid. In the next photograph here, we can see that the green indicator lamp has come on now for a float condition, and now this lamp indicating that the loads are being powered by the inverter and the solar is present. And let's see, what else would I mention on that front? By the way, if I mentioned that you can charge off of the grid by throwing that breaker that is the solar input to the the utility input, and that's right here, which is normally left off, but it will allow the inverter to charge the batteries essentially using grid power. And I wouldn't recommend that you ever do that unless you've gone through an extended power outage and your batteries have been deeply discharged and now utility power has returned and you're perhaps still into some cloudy weather and you're not feeling you're going to see a full state of charge for a while. You could always flip that utility switch on. It will then power the loads off of the grid, because there's also an internal transfer switch in the inverter, and it will charge the batteries back to a full state of charge. So that's kind of a rough overview. This particular breaker should always be on, as should all of these. Let me run through the breakers on this just a little more closely. If we look at the inverter solar panel here, this is the main breaker from the inverter. If you throw that off, then this panel is entirely dead. And the other breakers in this panel would go dead. This is the transfer outlet. So it's a 20 amp breaker that allows this transfer to take place to the inverter, and you want that to always be left on as well. And then this is the transfer circuit, the power from the inverter going to that transfer switch. That should always be on as well. And this is an outlet located right up in this corner that is inverter only. So as long as this breaker is on, this outlet is going to always be on the inverter and solar, regardless of the transfer switch. So do not plug your freezers into there, or they will continue to run, regardless of state of charge of the battery, until they have discharged the battery. In the event that you haven't had enough sun to keep up with it, they will discharge the battery right till the inverter shuts down under low battery condition, which is ultimately to protect the batteries from being discharged flat. But it's still pretty low state of charge when the inverter shuts down. So, okay, those are those breakers. And then if we look down here, these are the two that I mentioned earlier. This one goes to the transfer circuit and should always be on. This one is normally left off, and it's the grid power to the inverter. So this, of course, being the outlet that is the transfer circuit now. The other thing I would mention is that these two available spots here, this one and this one, could be additional circuits to, for instance, the house that would be on the transfer circuit. So anything off of these two open breaker slots will also transfer on and off the solar based on state of charge, and again fail to the solar in the event of a power outage. They will switch to the solar regardless of state of charge. And that's kind of a brief overview of the system. The only thing we still have to do is upgrade the firmware on the charge controller so that we can get this transfer on voltage setting properly programmed. We'll take care of that as soon as that firmware upgrade arrives on my computer. And occasional checking of the battery water and watering with distilled water is the only other real maintenance you should have to do, aside from seasonally, twice yearly, adjusting the PV array to the winter or summer position. So that's kind of an overview, and I'm going to wrap this for now, and I'll check in with you later.